Hi guys, so my camera broke, so this is going to be the best that you get for the lecture this week. Yeah, so we are talking about infancy, and we're going to talk about some of the physical development, some of the psychological and cognitive developments that's going on with the baby. During infancy, babies are growing at a faster rate than the rest of their life. By 5 months old, the birth rate has, or the weight has doubled, and it triples within a year to an average of about 22 pounds. And that's important. The baby fat helps them to regulate their body temperature, helps to give them resources for any time when they're not being fed, helps their brain to develop, and so on. So that baby fat is really important. The baby's head tends to be large compared to the rest of their body. This is what's called the cephalocaudal principle, which is where the head develops first before the rest of the body. It's kind of a creepy picture, but it really shows you that cephalocaudal is the head is growing first, and proximodistal principle states that the center also develops first. So the chest and abdomen is developing before the arms and the legs, because of course that's where all the vital organs are. You could have a baby with no arms and legs and it could survive just fine. So those get developed last, just like in the embryo, where the spine developed first. And so there's the myth that unborn babies have tails, right? But that's just the spine. So the neurons are developing super fast. It starts to develop around 7 weeks in utero, and the majority of neurons that a person will ever have are produced by the middle of prenatal development. So there's tremendous brain growth during the first year of life. Although an infant's brain is only about a quarter the size of an adult's brain at birth, it grows to about 70% of the adult size by 2 years of age. They have billions of brain cells, also called neurons, that are, and if you look at, a neuron, so there would be another neuron here, another neuron there, they're like chains, and they are separated by just a little gap in between them called the synapse, okay? And that's basically how neurons connect, is through the synaptic gap or synaptic cleft. And the peak time for the development of these connections among neurons is during the first year, kind of the first 2 years of life, which is why learning a language is so easy at that time. So brain growth is also it's having some interesting things going on. One is synaptic exuberance, where dendritic connections multiply like crazy. Okay, so go back to that chart. So these are the dendrites. This is the dendritic end of the axon, and you just have tons and tons and tons of these dendrites. And that's because baby needs to learn really quickly during that time period. And so the brain is just doing everything it can to make connections as quickly as possible. So that's called overproduction or synaptic exuberance. Also, you're having myelination happen. Axons are becoming encased in myelin sheath, and that is these little tubes kind of thing. That's a fat layer or a lipid layer, and it's like insulation on electrical wiring that helps the electricity to stay in the wire. The brain also works on electricity, and this is just insulation that helps the electricity to stay in the axon as messages are sent down the neuron. This is also why your child pees their bed, because the brain tells the bladder to hold on to the urine, and the message in the sleep gets lost along the way because the myelin has not developed very well. Some kids develop their myelin sheath very late, and myelination is delayed, and so also they continue to wet their bed, sometimes even into their teenage years. So punishing your child is not going to train them to not wet their bed. Shaming your kid will not train them to not wet their bed. This is a brain development issue, and luckily nowadays there is medicine that can help speed myelination. So if your child is wetting their bed past, I don't know, 6, 7 years old, then you can go get them that medication, and that should help. You also have something called synaptic pruning. Efficiency in the brain is increasing because of this. So as a baby, you want the child to be sensitive to all incoming information. But as you get older, you need to specialize. You become good at music or art or writing or math or whatever it is that's your thing. You become more focused and more specialized. And this is because of synaptic pruning. If you don't use it, you lose it. So this is good in the sense that you can become really good in certain areas of life. It's also bad in that there's some very basic processes in life that you can also lose. For instance, if you don't talk to your child in the first few years of their life, then they can lose the ability to speak because that gets those synapses, those neurons get pruned as well. The connections get deleted. If you don't give your child connection, relationship, socialization, then that can also be synaptically pruned, and they can lose the ability to connect to people. That's called reactive attachment disorder. I don't think I'm going to go over this. This is all review about the regions of the brain. I think you probably will know all of that, but this is important. So, the brain plasticity is the ability of the neurons to respond to environmental influences and to change and make connections or disconnect, as the case may be. So, infants' brains are highly plastic. They're highly responsive to environmental circumstances. Again, why a baby can learn to speak 20 different languages by 2 years old, but a 32-year-old has a much harder time learning even one language because the brain is not as plastic. The older we get, the less plastic it is, the less ability there is for the brain to change. Now, this is great because the baby can learn so much so fast, but it can also learn and change things. Like, for instance, if you raise the child in an abusive household, that also changes the wiring of the brain. If you allow your child to watch TV and play on iPads and cell phones, research has shown that a child that does, is exposed to electronic devices before five and before years old, I can't speak today, then it significantly increases the chances of attention deficit disorder as well as behavioral disorders. Basically, you are wiring your child's brain to become a brat. So don't give your child phones to play with. Okay, don't let them watch TV or minimize it significantly because you are literally rewiring your brain. Now, another example of this is in Romanian orphanages. So Romania had a socialist dictator who, like socialists generally believe, that the government could raise your children better than you could raise your children. So he encouraged parents to have lots of kids and then to give them to the government. And so there's tons and tons of orphanages in Romania. And of course, as happens in orphanages, the children were strongly neglected. They weren't really abused. There's some abuse, but that wasn't the big thing. It was just neglect, where there were not enough caretakers and there wasn't a lot of one-on-one or any interaction at all. I'm going to post a video for you guys to see this. And so their brains did not develop well. Now, this is the cognitive abilities of a child in England, less than 6 months old, and they're scoring about 105. This is a Romanian orphan at about 6 months old, and you can see it's only slightly lower. But now the longer the child stays in the orphanage, the more dramatically decreased their cognitive abilities are. And the older they were when they were adopted, the more permanent this was as well because of the plasticity of the brain, and it wired itself in an unhealthy manner because of the unhealthy environmental influence. All right, so sleep and the infants. Newborns sleep all the time, about 16 to 17 hours a day, sometimes more. But by 3 to 4 months, that has decreased dramatically to 6 to 7 hours a night. And they are generally sleeping through the night. Like I said in the last chapter, French children are usually sleeping through the night by 2 months old. And sometimes American children are not sleeping through the night at 2 years old. So a lot of it is cultural patterns where French approach child sleeping in a much different way. Like they don't let kids cry it out, but they do the pause thing that I talked about in the last chapter. So they just wait a couple minutes to make sure the kid actually needs to be comforted and not just that they're fussing and about to go back to sleep. Now, another part about sleep is sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS. When I was a kid, this was just sort of becoming a thing that we knew about, and most people believed SIDS was really just the parent had murdered the child during the night, and which is actually sometimes the reason for a child dying, and it's not SIDS. But SIDS is a thing where happens within the first year of life, and the baby just dies, and nobody knows why. There's no reason as far as they can tell. Now, this is the highest risk factor is 1 to 4 months old. And there's that critical development period. There's also vulnerabilities. Some infants are more vulnerable to SIDS, so like preemies, babies with breathing problems, uh, babies who are low birth weight, low APGAR scores, have some sort of dysfunction like in the cardiorespiratory system. Also, environmental risks if parents smoke, if they're too warm, soft bedding, sleeping on their stomach, those all increase the chance of SIDS. Things that decrease it is putting the child on their back and also co-sleeping. If parents sleep with their babies, then the risk of SIDS absolutely plummets. Now, there are issues with co-sleeping. In westernized countries, hardly anybody co-sleeps. Some people will say that you are an abusive murderer. Even if you haven't killed your child, you're still a murderer. I've seen it on Facebook because people are crazy on Facebook. So in the westernized countries, we're really anti sleeping with your babies. However, in developing countries, this is normal, and they even feel like it is child abuse or at least neglect if you don't sleep with your baby. And it does promote a close parent child bond, that it can really help with bonding with your child. Also, it helps with like breastfeeding. You don't even have to wake up every single time. The baby can just feed themselves, which is kind of cool. Protects the baby from illness, injury. I mean, there are a lot of benefits, and you can co-sleep safely. Um, so you just have to, like, for instance, you don't drink alcohol, you don't do drugs. If you smoke, you shouldn't co-sleep. If you're obese, you shouldn't co-sleep. So again, co-sleeping is great, but just read up on it before you do that to make sure that you are doing that safely. So nutritionally, obviously, if we're talking about infant nutrition, we're talking about breastfeeding. Breast milk is the ideal food for infants, obviously. It's high fat, it's also high carbs, which is important because carbs helps you to put on weight and you need a baby to gain weight quickly. Um, Most cultures will start to introduce solid foods around 6 months old. 4 months is like the minimum. The younger a child is when solid foods are introduced, the more likely they are to develop food allergies. So you really should wait until 6 months. But generally, experts will agree that you give children solid foods when they begin to reach for solid foods. So if they want the food, then you can start to give them like pureed or pre-chewed or mashed solid foods. Now, the World Health Organization suggests that you continue to breastfeed until at least 2 years old, 2 years old minimum. And many cultures will just continue to breastfeed until another child is born. And in hunter-gatherer cultures, that's usually about 3.5, 4 years on average. So that's what's most typical. When you do introduce solid foods in our westernized culture, rice cereal or oat cereal is the most common. It's easy for the baby to digest. However, that's not necessarily what you have to do. Other cultures will do whatever is native to their region, and most of them don't have grains to eat because that requires farming. So a hunter-gatherer culture would do like uh, fruits or vegetables, and then meat will come last. So you give grains, fruits, and vegetables first before you give meat. You can read about malnutrition. Obviously, this isn't an issue in our country, at least not blatant malnutrition to the point where they develop marasmus or wasting away from lack of nourishment, which is all those horrific pictures you see, like this one. That is a picture of a child with marasmus, which will cause permanent damage to their brain and body, which is really unfortunate. Now, we do have malnutrition in our culture, but usually it's because parents are feeding their kids processed food and junk food. For instance, in the areas like Tennessee and Kentucky and stuff, a lot of parents give their children Mountain Dew in a bottle, like infants Mountain Dew, and I don't know how they don't realize that that's really bad for them, but they don't. And so there's a lot of malnutrition issues in kind of these, poverty communities, inner city or rural whites, places where there's a lot of poverty. There are malnutrition issues, although it's not as blatant as marasmus. It is still extremely harmful for the child and for their development. You can just read about these things. Okay, so let's talk about some motor development. So you have gross motor development and you have fine motor development. Gross motor development is whole body movements using large muscles like crawling, lifting the head, turning over, sitting up. Fine motor movement is precise small movements such as using your opposable thumb to pick things up. Most gross motor development occurs within the first year. This, if a child is not crawling and probably walking within the first year, then there might be an issue, but there is a lot of variation. Some children, and it's a lot of it's culturally based. Some cultures really encourage a child as young as like 2-3 months old to start walking, and so they develop walking earlier. And other cultures, like for instance, my sister had a baby and she was very, like, she didn't want the child to be put on a dirty floor. There had to be a towel or there had to be a blanket down or something. And so he actually ended up not learning how to crawl. So he went from just kind of laying there to walking. And he skipped crawling entirely because he was just never allowed on the floor. So walking was okay, but crawling around the floor was not okay. So just a weird, just a weird quirk of culture. Now, fine motor development takes longer to develop. By 9 to 12 months old, we have this pincer grasp, which is where a child can use their thumb and their forefinger to pick up small objects, or to pick up objects, period. By 5 months old, they can usually pick things up and transfer it from one hand or to their mouth. But 9 to 12 months, you really see that very fine thumb and forefinger movement. Then we also have sensory development happening, depth perception. So this only happens when a child is crawling. So there was a great experiment that I'm going to show you of the visual cliff where they had this glass tabletop with a drop-off underneath of it to see when can infants understand depth perception. So I will show you that clip right now.
Everyone has had some kind of an experience feeling something kind of like fear of heights, and it makes perfect common sense that we shouldn't jump over the edge of a drop-off because it's dangerous, and if it's dangerous, then we should probably be afraid of it.
Probably. Exactly how and when this hypothetical fear develops makes for pretty gleeful research inside Dr. Karen Adolph's lab.
We're discovering some surprising things that are flying in the face of, how people have studied locomotion for the last 100 years.
Including what babies do and feel when they're on a ledge.
So the story about fear of heights is that there was a very, very famous classical study in developmental psychology by Gibson and Locke in 1960 that showed that human infants and infants of a number of different species will avoid crossing over an apparent drop-off on what they called a visual cliff.
As soon as the baby can move about, he can be observed in the same way as other animals.
It's a glass table, and on one side there's a checkerboard pattern surface right under the glass. The other side of the table, the pattern surface is way down on the floor, so visually it looks like a big 3-foot drop-off. So when human babies first begin crawling, most of them will crawl over the apparent drop-off, but after several weeks of crawling experience, then they'll begin to refuse to crawl over the drop-off. And the conventional interpretation of this was that infants are avoiding the drop-off because they're afraid of heights.
She's backing away very
No, she's not interested.
She wants no part of that side.
The experiment became the shaky foundation for the myth that crawling innately teaches us to fear heights.
Babies avoid going over the drop-off because they're afraid of heights. How do we know they're afraid of heights? Because they avoid crawling over the drop-off. So as you may have noticed, the argument is circular.
As it happened, the visual cliff was a better test of an infant's depth perception, not their fear of heights. And if you look closely, you may have actually noticed that the babies don't look particularly scared.
It is a perfectly safe surface of support. So after one trial, human infants cleverly figure this out, and then they will crawl over the drop-off.
So how do you really test if a baby's scared of heights?
You can test babies at the edge of a real cliff where there's no safety glass. It's just an actual drop-off, and the drop-off can be adjustable, so it can be little or really, really big.
And why stop there? Inside Dr. Adolph's Infant Action Lab, babies are tested on a variety of apparatuses.
You can test babies at the edge of a slope, so it can be steeper, 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 crossing bridges that are wide or narrow over a surface of support, and so on. If there's no safety glass, you can test the same baby dozens and dozens of trials in the same session. And that means that you can determine for each individual infant when they think that that surface is safe and when they think it's risky within a couple of degrees of accuracy, like 2 degrees of accuracy for a slope.
Dr. Adolph has spent 25 years running tests like these, and the resulting data sets are both convincing and adorable.
Infants spend most of each trial right at the edge of the precipice. They're reaching their arm down over the drop-off. They are putting their little feet or their little hands on the bridge and taking little tiny steps at the edge. And all the while they're doing it with either neutral or positive facial expressions.
What's more surprising is how their approach changes as they learn different forms of locomotion.
So what happens is that when babies first begin crawling, they'll crawl right over the edge. Then over weeks of crawling, their responses get more and more accurate until finally they're at adult-like levels so that they can tell precisely whether a slope is safe for crawling or whether a drop-off is safe for crawling. But then the next week, when these babies stand up and face these same drop-offs, same slopes, same apparatus, now as a new walker, they walk right over the edge. So in fact, there seems to be 4 learning curves in development as babies learn to sit, learn to crawl, as they learn to cruise, and then finally as they learn to walk. So if they were afraid of heights, you should just be afraid of heights. In the rain and on a train and in a tree, you shouldn't see 4 separate learning curves.
So if babies aren't learning to be afraid of heights, what are they learning?
I think that what babies are learning over weeks of sitting, crawling, cruising, walking is they're learning to perceive the relations between their bodies and the environment.
They're discovering what's possible and what's just a little too far.
And you can learn that without feeling any sort of fear at all. In fact, Eleanor Gibson, the person who first invented the visual cliff, wrote later in her life, as a goat is peering over the edge of a steep crag, it knows not to walk off the edge. And she said, I don't think it's feeling any emotions at all. It just knows not to go. And that's what we're seeing in babies.
Who probably know not to go. Probably. For Science Friday, I'm Luke Groskin.
Now, cognitively, babies are obviously developing extremely fast because this is when the neuronal development is happening. And also remember that it's also happening prenatally, so you can educate your unborn child, singing to them. I had a friend who was a marine biologist, and she would put headphones on her belly and play whale songs to her child. She was determined her child would also love marine biology. So you can stimulate and help your infant's brain to develop because neuronal growth is very dramatic during that prenatal period. But it's also, of course, extremely important during the infant period. Now, let me give you a caveat. A lot of parents are very enthusiastic about educating their child in infancy. You can overstimulate the child's brain, which is also not good. So you need some stimulation, but children also need downtime. They need to just play and be kids. All right, so let's talk about PSJAs Theory. So he has these 4 stages. There's actually a 5th stage, but it's for adults, so we won't get into it in this book, in this class. But 0 to 2 years old is sensory motor stage, which is obviously what we are dealing with in this chapter, 0 to 2 years age. And this is when they start to coordinate their senses with motor activities. So I hear something and I turn my head to look at it, or I see something interesting, I reach out to grab it. So this is occurring during the first 2 years, and they are moving from reflex behavior to intentional behavior. They are learning to assimilate as well as accommodate new information. Assimilation is the cognitive process where we alter new information to fit into an existing scheme. And a scheme is like a set of ideas about something. And then accommodation is you change the scheme to adapt to new information. So for instance, let's say you're a Democrat, you don't like Trump, you believe he's anti-immigration, and then he donates $100 million to help immigrants. So if you assimilated that information, you would alter the new information to fit into your existing scheme about Donald Trump. Well, he's just donating the money because there's an election coming up. So you've altered the information to fit your scheme. Or you could say, well, maybe I'm judging him wrong and he doesn't actually hate immigrants. So I'm going to change my scheme. I'm going to change my opinion to adapt to the new information. I'm sorry, you can probably hear my babysitting my mom's dog and he's going off in the backyard. Let me go grab him. Now, the other stages are preoperational, concrete operations, formal operations, and then there's also post-formal operations. But again, that one we won't get into. So this is actually coordinated along with physical brain spurts, brain growth spurts, whatever. So Piaget's theory is supported by biological research, and as the child's brain goes through these growth spurts, their ability to think increases. So preoperational is kind of like magical thinking, imagination. Concrete operations is where children are starting to think very concretely. They're able to start understanding science and experimentation, and usually puns go right over their head because they're thinking concretely. Then when children start getting those jokes, they're in formal operational thinking where you are able to think abstractly. Post-formal operational thinking is where you are able to have conflicting ideas and mesh them into a cohesive thought. So you're able to take two things that oppose each other and you're able to still have kind of a life philosophy about it. All right, so another thing that's happening in the sensory motor stage is object permanence. So children don't really have object permanence until around 8 months old. This is when you know that objects continue to exist even when you are not aware or seeing them. And this is why peekaboo is so fun with babies, because they think you have literally disappeared. And so around 8 to 12 months old, you're seeing that they do know that the object is still there. Like if you hide it, they'll lift something up to get to it. But they have the A not B error, where basically you hide it somewhere and then you let them see you hide it in a second place and they will still look in the first place. And let me show you a video so that makes more sense.
You ready? There he is. Very good, Jenna. There he is. There he is. There he is. He's got two eyes. Can I have the monkey? Here we go. You're holding on tight this time. You're holding on tight this time. There he is. There he is. Where is it? Oh, there he is. There he is.
Now, critics argue that infants' cognitive abilities may have been underestimated. The inability to locate a missing object may be more due to a lack of motor coordination rather than cognitive immaturity. So, a researcher named Béargent developed experiments to test infants' development of object permanence using what she calls the violation of expectations method. So when the researcher failed to meet the infant's expectations for the location of an object or the behavior of an object, this demonstrated that they had an awareness of the object. And it's some pretty amazing research, so let me show you a video clip.
At the University of Illinois, a team of researchers is now using ingenious experiments to discover previously unsuspected abilities of newborns and young children.
3 months, 22 days.
Professor Renee Bellajean studies how babies develop the concept of object permanence.
By object permanence, we mean really a set of beliefs about objects. The first and most fundamental belief is that objects continue to exist when hidden. The first person to investigate the development of object permanence beliefs in infants was Jean Piaget, the famous Swiss psychologist. And he claimed that it's not until approximately 8 to 9 months of age that infants understand that objects continue to exist when hidden, and that it's not until approximately 12 months of age that babies begin to understand that objects not only exist but retain their physical and spatial properties when hidden. What we've done is to devise a series of tasks where the infant simply had to look at possible and impossible events.
In this experiment, a 6-month-old baby watches a cart rolling down tracks, going behind a screen and coming out the other side. The screen is lifted to show a block sitting behind the tracks. Next, the baby sees the block placed on top of the tracks. The screen comes down, the cart rolls exactly as before. But in the real world of permanent objects, the block should have stopped the cart. The baby stares longer at this apparently impossible event.
When infants are surprised or puzzled by an event, they tend to look at it longer. So our prediction is always that if infants perceive the events as we do, then they will look longer at the impossible or magical event than at the possible event. And what we found is that infants as young as 3.5 months of age, and perhaps younger, but certainly as young as 3.5 months of age, understand that objects continue to exist when hidden. One contribution of this research is to say that we must really take a very close look at infants' physical knowledge. It's much richer, much more sophisticated than used to be thought.
Just down the hall from Carl, Renee Bellajean is finding out when that sense of the possible begins to develop. Renee's group puts on magic shows for babies, with results that have astonished her colleagues around the world. Each show tests whether babies know some basic physical rule, that objects can't just disappear, for example.
If babies have the knowledge, they will be puzzled or surprised or intrigued by our magical events. And we know when babies are surprised or puzzled, they tend to scrutinize the events, to look and look and look at them. And so what we do in our experiments is compare infants' responses to magical events and non-magical or real events to see whether they look longer at the magical than at the real ones.
As Holly's attention is captured, a hidden observer starts the timer. This time it's a non-magical normal event. The 3-month-old is soon bored. She looks away and the clock is stopped. Now for the impossible or magical event. Holly stares. She really scrutinizes the event. That means she's surprised. Even at 3 months, she knows the world doesn't work this way. Backstage, there's a simple explanation. 2 dolls moved independently. But Holly is riveted and even startled by such an illogical sight. Over many trials, 3-month-olds have been consistently surprised by the disappearing doll trick. They all seem to understand it's not possible. But take a look at the next result. Babies like Felix, who were just 2 weeks older, were not surprised. Renee concluded that their worldview was more sophisticated.
These babies spontaneously came to the conclusion that we were using two different objects, two minis, to produce the event. And so what we did to test this interpretation was to lower the screen at the start of each event. We say, no, this is not what's going on here.
Okay, he thinks, I see they've got just one doll up there. But unknown to Felix, when the arch is raised, the second doll is slipped back in. And once again, these slightly older babies were back to being surprised, which seems to confirm Renee's conclusion that they had figured out the original trick. In the box experiment, Renee's been testing what babies know about falling. 3-month-olds like Holly don't find the non-magical event interesting. They soon look away. But in the magical variation, that's much more interesting, really worth staring at. So it seems that by 3 months, babies have learned that unsupported things should fall. But once again, there was a twist to the story. Slightly older babies usually weren't upset when the box just hung in midair. Now it was the researchers' turn to be surprised.
We were very, very puzzled by that result. And it actually took us weeks and months of thinking through what could be going on and trying all kinds of different hypotheses until finally one day we came to this idea that, my goodness, what if they thought that somehow the finger, which was the only thing in contact with the box, had become attached to it? And that's why they weren't surprised. They were generating an explanation, in this case an incorrect one, but a sort of relatively plausible one for the box's failure to fall.
To test this explanation, they changed the trick so that the finger lost contact with the box. And sure enough, the babies were once again startled by the sight.
It is absolutely remarkable that such little babies, when shown our surprising events, are actively thinking about what we show them and actively searching for and finding explanations for what they see. I think it really gives us a fascinating insight into what babies are doing when they look at the world around them.